Great. So we have most everyone sitting down now. So I'm delighted to kick off the second part of this great WiMENA conference today. My name is Jacqueline Bourke. I'm Senior Creative Director, otherwise known as Bulldog Bourke or Bulldozer Bourke, in my very, very brief stint in rugby in my late teens. But I am absolutely delighted to be with you all to genuinely talk to you what we're most passionate about at Getty Images, which is moving the world through the power of sports visuals. So a bit of a PowerPoint presentation from me, but sit back, relax and enjoy. And I'm also delighted to say that I am sharing purely exclusive, brand new, spanking, fresh research that has come in. So you're the first to hear it, not just here for WiMENA as a region, but all over the world. So as you might expect, it's very exciting news for us at Getty Images that we live in an increasingly visual world. However, we do know for our customers, for our sports rights holders, for our brand sponsors, that it is becoming increasingly challenging to really cut through that landscape of content oversaturation to be seen and to be heard. And we also know that it has never been more important to close the visibility gap on women and girls in sport. Inclusive visuals are incredibly important in order to really create that sense of belonging, but also to drive further participation in sports. Now, everything that we do at Getty Images very much is backed by data. And so I'm proud to present to you, if you have not heard about it, Getty Images Visual GPS, which is our dynamic, always-on insights platform that you can see at gettyimages.com. And essentially, we have been pioneering visual research methodology in the sports industry to understand what types of sports visuals are connecting with people today across different types of demographics, countries around the world. And so we take a three-pronged approach when it comes to really giving you very valid visual recommendations for your visual approach to capture your intended audiences. So you can see here on the screen 3 circles. The top circle is where, since 2020, in an ongoing, consistent fashion, we have been conducting consumer market research to really begin to understand what are consumers' attitudes, behaviors, and most importantly, what types of visuals do they want to see in your visual strategy around sport. And then we also have a look at, well, what's happening across visual appetite. So my team look at 2.7 billion searches on our website platforms. And I can tell you, for example, when we went through the COVID pandemic, there was a huge drop-off when it came to our customers globally looking for visuals of female athletes. So we're talking about female athletes being 10 times on average less searched for than their male counterparts. And then finally, we also have a look at, well, what are media, for example, around the world? What types of visuals are they downloading? What types of visuals are they, really putting into their publications that gives a sense of our visual history when it comes to women and girls in sports? So I'm going to start off as we deep dive on this journey to really just reiterate that the role of sports, when we speak to everybody around the world, no matter their gender, the region that they're based in, or their age, they are now looking at the emotional benefits of sport far outweighing the physical benefits. And a lot of that has really increased since we've seen the COVID pandemic. And so much so that we're now seeing that there's a huge expectation on sports rights holders, on brand sponsors, to really ensure that they are driving a sense of inclusion and a sense of belonging within sport. And first and foremost, it's really down to accessibility, and then it's also down to really ensuring through the visual strategies that you're driving that atmosphere that's genuine, that's relatable when it comes to bringing an intersectional lens to your storytelling. But today, we're really going to prominently focus on women and girls in sport, and I think we can honestly say, and I don't think it's surprising to anyone in the room, that women and girls around the world, and especially across MENA as a region, do really believe that they are on the sidelines when it comes to stories that are being told. And they really do see that the gender divide actually starts at a younger age. The only country where we see this different is the United Arab Emirates, but we'll go through that in the data. So first and foremost, when we think about what do we mean by closing the visibility gap around women and girls in sport, we often think of looking back to our legacy, our archives, what is our history? And behind me on the screen here, you can see on the right-hand side, and I'm sure some of you will recognize this iconic image in the room, but this is from the 1969 Boston Marathon. This is Kathy Schwitzer. She really had to fight off a male official from the Boston Marathon, and he was fighting against some of her male competitors and her coach to really allow her to keep running and to complete that marathon. So much was the outrage at her actually participating in that. And so when we look back at Getty Images and we analyse what are the types of visuals when it comes to women and girls in sport that the media, that our customers are choosing to remember to show the journey we've been on, often it's about those stories of the game changers, the trailblazers, those that have really fought and constantly fight to bring down gender barriers. And so this is a range of examples here, and I won't go through them all, but we often look at in the run-up to Olympics, what are our media customers, again, choosing to remember. And it is brilliant that we see an increase in visuals around female athletes over time is being remembered. It's often the story of the first female athlete to carry the Olympic flame, for instance. But again, what would be really incredible to see is that we're seeing much more stories being told, not only at an elite level, but beyond the first and also across the grassroots levels. Now, I always pause for a moment, and you might say, the COVID pandemic, why are we talking about the COVID pandemic? It's been a while and we want to forget about it. But I can honestly tell you that when it comes to sports visuals, we often think about the 3 Ps. We think about power, we think about perseverance, and we think about personality. And traditionally, a lot of visuals in sports often focus on those 3. But with the impact of sports visuals, with the COVID impact, and such huge disruption to the sports industry, we at Getty Images in our 30 years suddenly were capturing stories the likes of which we had never captured before when it comes to sport. And that was down to the disruption to a lot of our female athletes, and we knew that visual search, for instance, was not increasing. It was actually declining rapidly during COVID. And we wanted to tell those stories to keep female athletes within the lens, within the media. And often those stories of, strength as perseverance became stories of vulnerability as strength, as people and athletes, both male and female, really tried to adapt to these changing environments. So from our freshest research, which we have been doing ongoingly over the last number of years, we are now seeing that women's participation in sports varies regionally, but on average, it is just about 1 in 4 women that are participating in sport. And that the largest demographic that is driving participation in sport is younger males or male Gen Zs. And we're going to talk a little bit about them at the end. But overall, what's actually quite interesting to see, and this survey was conducted in Q1, so between January and March of this year, what we're really beginning to see is that women in UAE, across MENA, women in Europe and women in LATAM are not actually falling very far behind when we compare them to that younger male generation. So I apologize, there's a lot of graphs here, but if you look at the graph with the blue on it, this is the difference between the genders, and on the right-hand side you can see the pull-out for the different countries. The dark purple is active participation in sport, the light purple is where you're following or you're watching sport, and then the grey is no participation at all on any of those 3 modes. The other piece of information that we've really learned is, where women are not participating across regions, and we're going to look at some of those key differences between MENA and the rest of the world, what are the top barriers that women feel when it comes to sports participation? And then equally, what are the top motivators that gets them into sport? So again, a very kind of detailed graph, but what we're seeing here is that most countries, women in most countries around the world, are telling us that it's really down to not finding the time or really feeling that they don't have the ability to participate in a certain sport or sports. What we can see across the MENA region, there's an interesting pattern that's rising that we don't see in other countries all around the world, is that I can't see myself, I can't see myself as the type of person who will participate in this sport. And interestingly, we heard about this on the last panel, is really about my friends and family are not involved. And we do see when it comes to motivators, family involvement is very, very important. When it comes to what are the primary benefits, again, it's not the physical side, it is the emotional or the mental health side. And so again, we're really seeing that mental health across the world is the primary driver for women's participation in sport. And again, what's quite interesting, if we look at Saudi Arabia there, which we don't see in any other of the 25 countries we surveyed in, that they're really identifying women in Saudi Arabia that sports gives me a purpose in life, which is actually trending really, really high. And then in the United Arab Emirates, and it's interesting, and I was asked this question about the research when I teased it this morning, one or two people here today, we're seeing that they're the only country that is saying that they have growing up with sports. And again, it's interesting to understand the makeup of UAE and whether it's a lot of the expat community and Emirati within our data. But ultimately, really leaning into the emotional benefits is very important. And then finally, really speaking visually to mental health and really understanding how we're bringing a much more inclusive lens around that within sport is key. Now, across the world, we're seeing that close to 7 in 10 really do believe that more athletes and sports leagues should talk about mental health. And when I look at the last Olympics, bearing in mind that we're about to run up to the Paris Olympics in Tokyo, my team does a lot of analysis on understanding after the Olympics and during the Olympics, what are the really topical stories that are being downloaded by media customers. And this was a really interesting shift we had not seen before. And these two images you see here were in the top 10 images that were most downloaded by media customers at Getty Images. So again, it was really telling stories. This is Tom Daly, I'm sure some of you will recognize on the left-hand side, who spoke quite a bit in the media about his struggles with mental health in the run-up to the Olympics and, how he took to knitting to really help him. And I don't think we would have ever imagined at Getty Images that we would actually be photographing a male athlete knitting on the sidelines as he was partaking through the competition. We also had the story of Simone Biles, who was very brave, and introduced to the normal, person on the street, the twisties, for example, but really spoke about the importance of mental health and the decisions that she made for her journey as she went through the Olympics in Tokyo. So again, lots of athletes, but especially on the female side, really opening up cultural conversations about that sense of strength within sports storytelling. And then I won't pause too long on this slide, but we do spend quite a lot of time, looking over the years at what are the biggest shifts and patterns around visual storytelling for women. And we do know, for instance, if we go back as far as 2016, the sway of media content really focused on skill and athleticism and compassion between female competitors. In 2019, we had a big moment of a bubble between, driven by some of the key images from the US football team winning the World Cup, but again about how competitive is a female athlete actually allowed to be seen in visual storytelling, which drove enormous conversation. And then in 2021, and again, this is why I call out COVID, we've seen huge disruption, and suddenly we had Naomi Osaka leading cultural conversations about mental health, and again, the ball started to roll from there. So then, when it goes on to the most important question that sports rights organisations ask me when I travel around the world, and I'm just back from Saudi in the last 2 weeks, the biggest question I'm always asked is, but what are the top types of sports imagery that really connects with specific audiences? So again, what we're finding is, and I think there's no surprise here on some of this, but we're finding that if you think about all gender, all around the world, the consistency that we're seeing is that it's images around teamwork, number one, closely followed by images around diversity, equity, and inclusion, whether that speaks to seeing different ages engaging in sports, all genders engaging in sports, and everyday people who look like me. So that very relatable aspect of people engaging in sports that inspire participation. And then finally followed by active and healthy lifestyles. So here is a very interesting slide, and this again is looking at how women feel very differently across different regions around the world in terms of the types of sports imagery they most want to see. So North American women really want to see different women with different body shapes, types, and abilities. Latam women really want to see that everyday sense of somebody who looks like me participating in the sport. European women want to see people of different age groups the most. And then for Saudi women really want to see teamwork, they want to see images of active and healthy lifestyle, and they also want to see a wider variety of body types within the visual storytelling. And then finally, women from UAE most want to see people with disabilities. So we're going to come back and talk to that a little bit more after this. They also want to see more family involvement in the sports imagery, and they also want to see people of different ages. So we at Getty Images have really been working consistently since 2018, in particular with great intention on how do we bring people together, you know, whether it's journalists in the media, whether it's our brand sponsors, whether it's sports rights holders we're talking to, whether it's female photographers behind the camera, whether it's athletes, how do we bring everybody together to really have a conversation that's ongoing, that's collaborative? And we set up, I always call them dynamic guidelines for how you go about visualizing women and girls in sport. So I'm not going to go through those today, but I will talk to the top pillars, and you can find them on our website. What I can underline is that people of all genders want to see far more visibility around women and girls in sport. They also believe that, and they have an opinion on how that visualization actually happens. And so they absolutely want to see women portrayed in a very authentic way that focuses on their skill and their athleticism. So it really does come down to, in your visual strategy, how am I bringing an intentional, an inclusive, and an intersectional lens? Whether that's down to showing, you know, women and girls from all different socioeconomic backgrounds, ethnicities, whether it's about showing different body types and age and so on. There is a lot, there is an enormous amount of unseen and untold stories that you as a sports rights holder can really help drive a greater storytelling that makes people feel that they belong and that they're welcomed. Body empowerment is also a really, really interesting one. Now, when we ask people, and I think what I often find quite sad in the research, and you know, I look at a lot of spreadsheets, but when we see that, you know, the drive to see people with different body shapes, types, and abilities is often down to our respondents saying that they personally experience discrimination in their everyday lives, and that changing that visual storytelling and that normalizing it, what they actually believe will help them in their everyday lives. Now, we've seen earlier on one of the earlier panels, and it's a really big, important area for us at Getty Images, is, you know, understanding how do you tell stories that look at the life care of a female athlete when we know that there are enormous gaps, and thanks to Lisa O'Keefe from the IWG clarifying for us that only 8% of research actually focuses on the female physiology, and that has an impact on investment within the sport. But also when we think about the rise of conversations now around pink concussion and so on, it actually has an impact, incredibly so, not just on society at large, but on our athletes that are so important to all of us. So again, these are just a range of images, and I won't go through them all, but there are some powerful moments when we look back at visual storytelling around women in sports that caused controversy, that got people's attention, and then there's been evolving stories in the background. You'll all recognise, I'm sure, what was Elsa Montano, who was termed the pregnant runner, who actually ran not once but twice while pregnant, at 8 months the first time and at 5 months the second time. And at the time, there was powerful storytelling in the media, some of it backed up by Elsa, just saying that, you know, it really showed the power. It really showed the power of female physiology and what it can do to be able to participate at that level at elite sports. However, as we've seen in recent years, the narrative really has changed. And Elsa's came out to talk about the fear, which a lot of female athletes talk about, you know, that she would lose brand sponsorship, for instance, and that, you know, there would be stalls in her career and she wouldn't be able to keep going. And there's lots of conversations about parenthood. So again, Sophie Power just underneath Elsa Montano there. Again, you know, a really powerful image. You know, this is Sophie running the 108, you know, kilometre Ultramont Blanc trail. And again, just really seeing her, you know, breastfeeding her son, Cormac, who's, you know, I think 3 months at that stage beside a male competitor. So lots and lots of moments of these storytelling, but the more that they're brought up in the press, the more that they're shared, the more that, you know, really strong voices across the sports industry really looks at the power of these visual storytelling to talk about parenthood and sport, to talk about mental health. We're seeing that having an impact on the visuals that brands and your brand sponsors are actually leaning into right now. So again, lots of storytelling happening here from UAE to the UK to the US and so on, that's really looking to tell that story of different body shapes, sizes and abilities. And then finally, emotions. So I noticed a lot of nods in the room when I spoke about, how competitive are female athletes really allowed to be and the range of emotions that they're allowed to express. And so, we over the last few years have been talking through the Women's Sports Trust and, through lots of sports rights organisations, when we work with projects on them, we talk to athletes directly. And it's really interesting to hear from female athletes, when they show up to do, let's say, shoots for the sports rights organisation, they don't feel they're allowed to express the same range of emotions, or they're not asked to express the same range of emotions as their male counterparts. So, for example, we've had a female bowler, say to us, I look over my male counterpart and he can be fierce and he can be this, and I'm asked to smile, smile, smile and be really, really positive. It's interesting then, because you talk to some female rugby players and they'll tell us, well, I'm always asked to do the same 3 and 4 poses. I know them off by heart right now. I zoom in, I zoom out, and I'm gone, because they're not actually being brought into to the heart of the storytelling. So I wanted to showcase a recent example that we did with Belinda Moore, CEO of the Premier Women's Rugby last year, towards the end of the year when she went to launch PWR. And I think she took a very brave step to really work with us at Getty Images, but she really understood that you had to center the female athlete's voice within the creative process to tell their own stories. So this is a really great example of a campaign that was 100% powered by women, both in front of and behind the camera, from creative strategy all the way through to final curation by the female athletes themselves. You had a range of rugby players from all different backgrounds, different body shapes, sizes. You had Abby Burton here in the bottom right-hand corner, 11 weeks, she did the shoot after giving birth. You've got the very fair Shauna Brown here as well. But again, what was really important to us at Getty Images was not only using the Women and Girls in Sport guidelines to understand, and this point was brought up earlier on panels, female athletes have to work very hard on social media to reach out to grow their engagement with fans. They were very interested. We did an educational session with them to understand, well, what do fans actually want to see on social media? I could give a whole other talk on how social media visual aesthetics is actually changing visual storytelling in sports as well. But again, what they fundamentally, and it was their choice, they didn't want to wear their kits, which would be the traditional, they wanted to be more accessible, more relatable, and to really bring fans into their world. So really, really great piece of storytelling. And then finally, there is an aging out of sports. Now, we see this, kind of less coming up in the data from MENA at the moment, but it's certainly one to watch. And there's an interesting story around as well that I'm going to talk about in our last story. But in terms of the aging out of sports, again, what can we do when it comes to women and girls in sports, but more on the older age of the spectrum? We did a partnership with Women in Sport, and it was a really, really important case study that we have at Getty Images, because Women in Sport came to us and, they'd done really interesting research that shows that there was huge drop-offs around women in midlife between the ages of 40 to 55 who may be going through the perimenopause or the menopause. And this really increased even more, because often they were the sandwich generation as we went through the COVID pandemic. So we worked under very difficult circumstances through lockdowns and COVID to capture the stories of real women all up and down the UK from all different types of backgrounds, who were really trying to make a difference with their local football clubs or with their children as single parents, or open water swimming friendship groups, for instance. Now, the piece I just want you to take away from this is that while it was very UK, and you could tell it in a lot of the weather conditions in the sky and so on, within 6 weeks of this, being launched and put on our website, what Women in Sport did was they wanted to offer it to everybody. All customers at Getty Images could license this content because they wanted to leave a legacy. And what we found was it was very quickly downloaded in over 145 countries around the world. So it did show that there was an appetite, but it wasn't coming through the searches. So again, if you create the right relatable content, we often find customers will come towards it. So it's a good opportunity to think about that if you're working with key brand sponsors. And then second last piece I want to finish on today, and I do want to touch upon it, is disability. So we're really looking at an intersectional lens around women and girls. So again, from aging to disability, we're constantly at Getty Images through our service really focusing on how do people feel with disabilities? Do they feel that they're on the sidelines? And yes, they're telling us that they are. They tell us that they experience discrimination because they're seen to be weak, to be less than, and they want this to actually change. And we also see that across all types of gender and all types of people with disabilities or not, there is a huge drive, and people do want to see athletes with disabilities having equal coverage. But we really wanted to go one step further in our latest research to really break this down to understand, well, who is driving this, especially in the run-up, as we know that the Paralympics will have such a spotlight on it. So what we've seen is that women absolutely are really skewing those figures. And women from all countries around the world are showing much more stronger support for really wanting to see far more visual inclusion of athletes with disabilities. We also see that anybody who is actively involved in sport, who's playing in sport, no matter their gender or what region they come from, they also want to see people with disabilities getting that visual spotlight. And then finally, with the Paralympics coming up, are people interested in it? Do they have an awareness of this event? So what I can tell you here, as you can see on the screen, is we are seeing that about less than half of people around the world are aware of the Paralympics. We're also seeing that across MENA, there's much, much lower awareness of the Paralympics than there is in other countries and regions. If you look here on the right, I'm just trying to think, you're right, yes, your right-hand side, what's interesting there is, and this is bucking against the curve on anything we've ever seen, you can see that older generations are much more aware of the Paralympics and much more passionate about it. So you see the Z, the M, the X, the B, that's the Generation Z, the Millennials, Generation X, and Baby Boomers. So as you go up in age, far more awareness and support of the Paralympics. But for those who are aware, there is a very strong consensus that this is a mega event. It's hugely important, and it is accurately getting, from a consumer perspective, visual storytelling around people with disabilities right. Now, there's much, much deeper conversations that we can have about that, but we'll move on. And then my last point I'm going to talk about here is just really touching upon one key demographic that is really moving in a completely different direction from all of the other demographics that we're looking at. And so when it comes to visuals, we are seeing that male Gen Zs are really moving far more into the traditional visualization of masculinity in sport. Now, you can say to me, well, what does that actually mean and what does it look like? So here are some visual examples. Tops, if you think about that slide we've seen before with teamwork, diversity, equity and inclusion, and active lifestyles, for male Gen Z in particular, and you might say, what age group are male Gen Z? Well, they are about 12, 13 years of age, all the way up to buying their first mortgages or in the workforce at about age 27. So we're seeing that, visual sports images that show success and that show winning, that show, athletes at their prime that are heavily involved in their training, or athletes winning championships. They're the top three most connect with this age group. But I did want to pose just some questions around this, because there are subtle nods and shifts to the visualization around masculinity changing as well. So what you can see here is Noah Lyles, now the fastest man in the world. And what we see when he was in Oregon in 2022, the media picked visuals like this that we captured that were used in a lot of the storytelling in the media and there was lots of terms like he's the baddest man in sport and so on. And actually, when he became the fastest man in sport in Budapest in 2023, the visual story had changed. And it was interesting to me because Noah Lyles himself picked up this image that we had shot at Getty Images and shared it on his social media feeds to talk about, his moment of winning. So a complete difference. And it was he was talking about how vulnerable and emotional he really felt. And he'd often talked quite a bit from Tokyo to Budapest about the mental health challenges that he personally was going through. So there are interesting signs of shifts around this. But overall, we're coming to the end now. Overall, we're really looking at Getty Images to push for change. We understand very fundamentally that it's going to take all of us in the room here today and across the sports industry. So whether it's, journalists, whether it's brand sponsors, whether it's really key sports rights holders, governmental level, athletes, we really need to build a collaborative and creative process that's very intentional, that's very mindful of how do you actually build that sense of belonging in your visual storytelling for women and girls in sport that addresses those drop-offs that we're really seeing happening. And so that's it from me. I'm keeping an eye on the time to keep me honest. I'm within time. So that's it for me. But I do want Nicole and Emma to stand up for a minute, because I know we're running out and we're behind schedule today. But they are here with me from Getty Images as well, and we'd love to talk to everybody here. I will leave you with my own personal message. You know, I have a child. I have Gen Alpha that I'm watching coming up, who's 5. She's neurodiverse. She can't hear. She's got a rare genetic disorder. I'm now coaching for Irish Gaelic football on Sundays, mixed gender sports. But I can tell you the challenges that it takes when you have a girl like my little Juliet, who's got so many, barriers to participation, and how difficult it is actually just to get her to the sports field because she's got sensory disorder and so on. And then you're on the sports field, really telling wider stories around coaching, for instance. Male and female coaches approach it in very different ways. The shift, like from the competitiveness of skill to the emotions of what it actually means to belong. So I just want to leave you with the last point. There are, and I will put this in a caveat, I have the privilege for 13 years at Getty Images now to analyse and see so much visual storytelling around sport. And I can tell you we haven't even begun. Not only is it about shining that lens, but it's about how we shine that lens and what goes into the thought and the process and the creativity to tell those stories. And I am really excited to see how that takes place in MENA. I have to reiterate all of the other speakers here, from Katie to Lisa and so on. I've been out in Saudi twice this year, and I am, honest to God, have never seen it in my time, where I am going in to talk to, multi-sports clubs like Al Nazir, where I've got males in the room who are really talking passionately and bringing it up to me, about we want to see and we want to do better visual storytelling around women. We want to see, do better visual storytelling around people with disabilities. I don't always see that in my travels within the sports industry in the Western world. So that's it for me. Thank you very much. And you can let me know if we have any time for questions. Otherwise, we are here. Thank you.